Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, exploring Mao's consolidation of power. Until the Korean War radicalised the regime, Mao began cautiously. The communists' defence of the peasantry against the landlord class and the defence of the nation against the Japanese had earned them a great deal of goodwill. And Mao wisely didn't want to throw that away. What's more, despite the experience gained at Jiangxi and Yan'an, Mao still had need of the expertise of key stakeholders in the former society and could not afford to frighten them off. "We shall have to master what we do not know," he said just before taking power. "We must learn to do economic work from all who know how, no matter who they are. We must acknowledge our ignorance and not pretend to know what we do not know." This meant relying on both the experience of the Soviet Union and on those in the bourgeoisie who remained in China. More than anything, Mao was painfully aware of the backward nature of China's economy and of Chinese society. Consequently, economic development was the overwhelming priority, and that required political stability. Hence, the party's slogan, with no mention of socialism, was 3 years of recovery and 10 years of development. The most fundamental issue that China had faced, or refused to face, for centuries was the land issue. For the CCP, it was both a pragmatic and an ideological issue. Support for the communists came from the peasantry, and if that support was to be maintained, the peasantry had to be given land. And in destroying the landlord class, they would also eliminate a potential source of counter-revolution. An increase in agricultural production was also absolutely necessary if China was to industrialize. Ideologically, it wouldn't initiate a socialist society in the countryside, but it would, by ending the feudal system once and for all, at least be a step in the right direction. Something like a fifth of the land had already undergone reform, but that still left much untouched, and the CCP wanted to ensure that the remaining land was reformed in an orderly fashion. Things had got out of hand in the last years of the Civil War, and the CCP was eager to ensure stability at this critical period in the life of the new state. They sought to dampen peasant radicalism, and in order to do so, expelled many of the young village cadres who had led the indiscriminate killing of landlords and rich peasants. Restraint was now the order of the day. But the landlord class was still doomed. Unlike the national bourgeoisie, even the bureaucratic bourgeoisie in the cities, they had nothing to offer. They were parasites, living off the work of others. They simply weren't needed. And ideologically, they were the enemy. And though they only constituted around 4% of the rural population, they nevertheless still numbered some 20 million, owning about 30% of the land. And so the reforms would still have a profound effect on the lives of the poorer peasantry. But it needed to be done in an orderly fashion. So, as with Mao's preferred option at Jiangxi, the agrarian law of 1947 and the Agrarian Reform Law of 1950 sought to avoid the more radical social levelling option, in favour of one that protected the economically efficient rich and middling peasants, who, though constituting just 6% of the rural population, accounted for almost half of agricultural production. It was not intended that the landlords would be physically eliminated either, but would be given plots of land equal to that allocated to the poorer peasants. They would become useful, and the stigma of having been a landlord would fade after years of productive labour and political loyalty. They could even retain any commercial or industrial property, even if it involved employing workers. They would be simply reclassified as national bourgeoisie. As for rich peasants, none of their land or property was to be redistributed, even when hired labour was involved. They were even allowed to continue to rent land to tenant farmers. Middling peasants, too, were allowed to use hired labour. Production was the all-important factor. By laying down clear ground rules and by instructing local land reform cadres, who were trained for the job to oversee the changes, it was hoped an orderly transfer of land could be achieved. The party also decreed that if chaos threatened, the handover should be delayed for a year. However, the reality of landlords determined to hold on to their land and the pent-up hatred of the poorer peasants meant that things did not go so orderly as the party had hoped. This was particularly the case where landlords faced their poorer neighbours in struggle meetings, which were intended to force them to publicly accept their past wrongs, or else speaking bitterness sessions, which allowed poor peasants to face their former landlords over their past injustices. The potential for these to get out of hand was always real. And the Korean War only radicalised the movement. As the landlord class dug in, hoping for a nationalist resurgence, the CCP became more determined to eradicate them as a class, lest they rallied. As the war intensified, so did the land reform movement. Landlords were executed or else sent to labour camps as attitudes hardened. By the end of 1952, the landlord class in most regions had ceased to exist. But though most landlords found themselves farming small plots of land rather than being killed, there had still been more terror and violence than had been planned, with at least 1 million landlords and members of their families killed, either dragged out and beaten to death on the spot, or else publicly executed later. In this way, different to the extermination of the kulak class in the Soviet Union, the peasantry themselves led the physical attack on the landlords, not the party and not the state. Most importantly, between 1950 and 1952, the length of the campaign, total agricultural output increased by 15% per year. Agricultural production was significantly higher in 1952 than it had been in 1936, the best of the pre-war years. Incentive had been improved, but anti-pest campaigns, a significant increase in the use of insecticides and fertilizers had played their part too. The process of land reform had weakened kinship ties and had activated the peasantry, allowing the CCP to establish a presence in villages all over China. The peasant and his village, previously so localized, had been drawn into a national polity and a national economy. But though a great levelling had been undertaken in rural China, and the landless and poorer peasants were undoubtedly better off, there still remained clear social distinctions between poor, middling and rich peasants. And poverty remained, and the increase in production levels didn't keep up with population growth, much less provide surpluses for investment. Still, a bourgeois revolution had been undertaken in the Chinese countryside. The peasantry were all landowners now. The government issued title deeds, and the peasants were free to buy, sell or rent their land. They were also free to hire agricultural labour, to lend money, and to trade on the private market. These were the 4 freedoms, and within 3 years, somewhere between 20 and 25% of the population had sold land, with the sales mostly from the poor peasant to the rich. The CCP had made it clear that they viewed the situation as only temporary, a stage on the journey to collective ownership. But this seemed a long way off. I do hope this video proves useful for you. Now don't forget, there's my website, History Made Easier. That's there to help you too. Do check it out if you haven't already. But for now, let me thank you, as I always do, for listening, and wish you the very best of luck with your studies. Cheers.